Now we've seen the lineups for the semester. You can think of it as a sports event, some kind of baseball, football, basketball game. You know, the continental rationalists versus the British empiricists. The next philosopher that we're going to mention is a man called Immanuel Kant. You know, Kant was lived in the continent. He was actually in Prussia. We think of him as being German, and we refer to him as a German philosopher. And only recently, as I was teaching these courses, and I really took a look at the history, did I discover that he was from a place in Germany called Königsberg, which is now part of Russia. I think it's Kaliningrad. So it's kind of interesting the way things change. You live in one place and it's part of one country at one point, another part of another country at another point. But getting back to the issue of philosophy, Kant is considered one of the major figures, and Kant is sort of the hybrid approach between rationalism and empiricism. And he's well known in theory of knowledge, epistemology, although his ethical works, I think, are even more well known and even more influential, at least among common everyday people. And in a book called The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, it's actually his one of his introduction to his theory of knowledge is in there. He says that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. Dogmatic from dogmatism. That is, he believed things because he had heard them. He really didn't have good reason for believing what he was. He had been a rationalist, and then he heard David Hume's arguments, his skeptical arguments about the problem of induction. So David Hume kind of got him thinking about these sorts of problems. And as I mentioned, his response to skepticism, especially to Hume's problem of induction, is to try to synthesize, put some of the views of the rationalists, or some of their principles, together with some of the empiricists' principles, and from that he gets called the transcendental idealist. Very fancy term. We can spend a lot of time trying to figure out how it came up. Idealist because he was like a rationalist. There were ideals. Transcendental, he's going above it to synthesize it. It's a very, very complicated view, and we're really not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just thought it was important to know that Kant is a major figure, and Kant sometimes regarded with the same stature of Plato and Aristotle. And he says, that time and space are not part of the physical universe, but it's an ideal precondition for us to have experience. So following Leibniz a little bit, but adding a little bit more, he thinks somehow that time and space, and there are certain other concepts that our minds bring to the table. I'm not sure that that's a good answer to skepticism. We won't spend a lot of time on it. Very complicated view, and we're certainly going to have our plate full trying to get through the views of the rationalists and the empiricists on the problems we're talking about. What's interesting is he says that science is possible, but metaphysics is not possible, and he's really well known, or most well known in the world, for his ethical views, and it's something called a duty-based ethical system. Should be a hyphen between that. And we sometimes talk about the categorical imperative, and he says there are rules that embody our duties to ourselves and others. And if you're interested in that, very interesting view, take our ethics course. I know when I teach ethics, I certainly deal with it. So that's where Immanuel Kant fits in the picture. Now, a somewhat less known philosopher than Kant is Thomas Reid. That was the only picture I could find of him. That was quite a handsome picture. I've seen some of the other British guys wearing that similar bad hair day rag on their heads, but not quite flattering. But Reid was a less well-known philosopher, a contemporary of David Hume, lived in Scotland. his whole life, and he was kind of a late bloomer. That is, if you guys are not familiar with the word late bloomer, he was not like David Hume, where he had his philosophy, his great philosophical work, started while he was in college, but rather he started writing later on in life. I think he was in his 50s when he published his first book. And keep in mind, back in those days, 50 was well past most people's lifetime back in the 18th century in Scotland. And he provides an answer to Descartes and to Hume. And he thinks they made serious mistakes. And what he points out is, and I think this is going to ring to or chime well in some of your ears, you're going to think it makes sense, it's what's called common sense philosophy. And at some point after we start looking at some of these skeptical arguments, you guys are going to say, well, gee, I have more reason to think that there's a table and chair out there, to trust my common sense, than to accept the premises of these skeptical arguments. And that's the position that Hume takes on it. He's also well known with regard to the problem of freedom and determinism, and that's where we'll really spend some time on him, in defending libertarianism. That is, he does not think that people's actions are caused at all. He has a concept of what's called agent causation.